When the elderly widow opened her door to 30 Hell's Angels stranded in a monsoon, her neighbors called her insane. But she fed them her last scraps of food, gave them her quilts, welcomed these leather-clad strangers that the whole town feared. The next morning they left at dawn, and Margaret went back to her crumbling house with its rotted porch and collapsing roof, expecting life to continue as it always had, alone, struggling, surviving. Then at sunrise the next day, she heard the sound. A rumble that shook the ground. When she looked out her window, her heart stopped. 800 motorcycles stretched down the highway as far as she could see, and they were all coming to her house. But they weren't there for revenge. They were there for something the town would never forget. The screen door hung crooked on its hinges, swaying slightly in the hot Arizona wind that swept down from the Kaibab Plateau. Margaret Pearson stood on her weathered front porch, one hand shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, watching the dark clouds gather over the San Francisco peaks in the distance. At 73, she'd learned to read the sky like others read books, and what she saw now made her joints ache with memory. A summer monsoon was coming, and it would be a bad one. Her house sat on the eastern edge of Williams, where Route 66 curved away from the newer interstate and became a lonely stretch of cracked asphalt bordered by juniper and ponderosa pine. The paint had peeled away years ago, leaving bare wood that had weathered to grey. The roof sagged in the middle, where water damage had rotted through the supports. 2 windows on the upper floor were covered with plywood because she couldn't afford replacements. The porch steps groaned under her slight weight, the third one broken clean through. Margaret pulled her faded cardigan tighter despite the heat. The house had been beautiful once, back when Harold was alive, back when his contractor business kept them comfortable and he'd climb up on that roof every spring to check for damage. Back when their daughter would visit with the grandchildren, filling these empty rooms with laughter. That was 15 years ago, before the heart attack took Harold, before Rebecca moved to California and stopped calling, before medical bills and property taxes consumed everything Margaret had managed to save. Now she lived on Social Security and whatever she could grow in her small vegetable garden behind the house. The tomatoes were doing well this year at least, small mercies. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and something else, engine oil and hot metal. Margaret squinted down the road and saw them coming, motorcycles, 30 or more, riding in formation. The deep rumble of their engines echoed off the hills. She recognized the leather vests, the patches, the skull insignia even from this distance. Hell's Angels. Her heart didn't race with fear the way her neighbor Patricia Walsh's would have. Margaret had seen too much of life to judge people by their appearance. She'd known bikers before, good men mostly, who happened to prefer 2 wheels to 4, but she also knew what the town thought of them, how businesses would close their doors when a motorcycle convoy passed through, how Sheriff Calvin Murphy would follow them to the county line just to make sure they kept moving. The lead bike slowed as it approached her house, and Margaret could see the storm wall now, a grey curtain of rain marching across the desert floor behind the riders. They had maybe 15 minutes before it hit, and out here on this exposed stretch of road, with no shelter for miles, they'd be caught in the worst of it. The lead rider pulled into her dirt driveway, his bike kicking up dust. He was a big man, mid-50s, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a ponytail and a scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His vest identified him as Vincent Hawk Blackwell, and the patches marked him as someone important in the club hierarchy. The other riders pulled in behind him, parking their motorcycles in neat rows along the road. "Ma'am," Vincent said, removing his sunglasses. His eyes were surprisingly kind, crow's feet etched deep from years of squinting into the sun. "Sorry to bother you, but that storm's coming in fast and hard. Is there a garage or shelter nearby where we could wait it out? We don't want to get caught on the road when the lightning starts." Margaret looked past him at the approaching wall of weather. Sheet lightning flickered inside the clouds, and she could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Then she looked at the 30 men on motorcycles, their faces showing varying degrees of concern and discomfort as the first drops of rain began to fall. They were far from home. She could see the Flagstaff chapter markings on their vests, and they'd miscalculated the storm's speed. "There's no shelter for miles," she said, "but you can bring those bikes around back and come inside. I'll put on coffee." Vincent's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, that's kind of you, but there's 30 of us. We can't impose like that." "You can and you will," Margaret said firmly. "I've got 4 walls and a roof, and it's about to come down hard. Now move those bikes before they get soaked." Another rider pulled up beside Vincent, this one younger, but with the same weathered look. His vest identified him as Russell Forge Carver. "Hawk, we should—" "I heard the lady," Vincent interrupted. He looked at Margaret with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You sure about this, ma'am?" "I'm sure. Now hurry up." The bikers moved with impressive efficiency, guiding their motorcycles around the side of the house to the back, where an old carport provided minimal cover. Margaret hurried inside, her mind already calculating what she had in the pantry. 30 men. Lord have mercy. She had 2 pounds of ground beef in the freezer, 3 boxes of pasta, canned tomatoes, green beans from the garden, and the bread she'd baked yesterday. It would have to be enough. Through her kitchen window, she watched them securing their bikes as the rain began in earnest. Within seconds, it became a deluge, the kind of monsoon rain that turned roads into rivers and washed out low crossings. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and Margaret saw several of the bikers sprint for her back door. She opened it before they could knock, and they filed in, water streaming from their leather vests and boots. They were polite, almost painfully so, removing their wet jackets and boots without being asked, arranging them carefully by the door so they wouldn't drip on her floors. "I'm Margaret Pearson," she said, watching as more men crowded into her small kitchen and living room. "There are towels in the bathroom if you need them. I'm going to make spaghetti and meat sauce. It's all I've got that can feed this many, so I hope nobody's got dietary restrictions." Vincent stepped forward, water dripping from his hair. "Ma'am, Margaret, you don't have to feed us. You've already done more than enough just letting us in." "Nonsense. You're guests in my home, and guests get fed. That's how I was raised." She turned to her ancient stove and began pulling out pots. "There's a TV in the living room if you want to watch the weather, and the bathroom's down the hall. Make yourselves comfortable. This storm will blow through in a few hours." She could feel them exchanging glances behind her, could sense their confusion at being welcomed so readily. The youngest ones looked particularly bewildered, as if they'd never encountered anyone who didn't immediately fear or judge them. Russell approached the counter. "Can I help with anything?" "I'm pretty handy in a kitchen." Margaret glanced at him, noting the grease under his fingernails and the calluses on his hands. A working man. "You can dice those tomatoes from the garden," she said, pointing to a bowl on the counter. "And if any of you know how to fix a leaky faucet, the one in the bathroom has been dripping for 3 months." A ripple of movement went through the group. Within minutes, she had 3 men in her kitchen helping prepare food, 2 more examining her bathroom plumbing, and another checking the electrical outlet in the living room that had stopped working last winter. The rest distributed themselves throughout her small house, careful not to touch anything, mindful of their muddy boots, speaking in low voices as if afraid to disturb the space. Outside, the storm raged. Rain hammered the roof, and wind rattled the windows. Lightning flashed, turning the world white, followed immediately by thunder that shook the walls. Margaret worked steadily, browning the ground beef, adding the canned tomatoes and garden vegetables, setting water to boil for pasta. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking food and the warmth of too many bodies in a small space. "Ma'am," one of the younger bikers said hesitantly, "your porch steps are pretty rotted out. One of them's completely broken through." "I know," Margaret said without turning around. Been meaning to fix that. We could do it, Russell said from where he was chopping tomatoes. We've got tools on the bikes. Wouldn't take long. In this storm? You'll do no such thing, but I appreciate the offer. She felt Vincent watching her as she worked, his gaze thoughtful and assessing. When she glanced up, he didn't look away. Why? He asked simply. Why what? Why are you doing this? You don't know us. Most people in this town would have locked their doors and called the sheriff when they saw us coming. Margaret stirred the sauce, considering her answer. Through the kitchen window she could see the rain turning her small yard into a mud pit. My husband Harold used to say that character isn't revealed in how you treat people who can do something for you. It's revealed in how you treat people who can't. You boys needed help, and I was in a position to give it. Seems pretty simple to me. Most people don't see it that simple. Most people are fools, Margaret said bluntly. I've lived 73 years on this earth, and I've learned that a man's heart matters a whole lot more than the patches on his vest or the bike he rides. Now, is someone going to help me carry these plates, or are you all going to stand around philosophizing while the food gets cold? That broke the tension. Men moved to help, and soon Margaret's mismatched plates and bowls were distributed throughout the house, filled with spaghetti and meat sauce that was stretched thin but hot and filling. She'd given them most of it, keeping only a small portion for herself, but she'd learned long ago how to make do with less. They ate gratefully, many of them going back for seconds, despite her protests that there might not be enough. When the food was gone, they insisted on washing the dishes, and Margaret found herself sitting in her own living room while a dozen Hell's Angels cleaned her kitchen with surprising thoroughness. The storm continued through the evening, and as darkness fell, the rain showed no signs of stopping. Margaret brought out the quilts she'd made over the years, distributing them among her unexpected guests. Some men dozed in chairs, others sat in small groups talking quietly. Vincent and Russell sat at her kitchen table, and she joined them with cups of weak coffee. She'd stretched the grounds as far as they would go. You live here alone? Russell asked. For 15 years now. My husband passed and my daughter moved away. It's just me and this old house now. She looked around at the worn furnishings, the water-stained ceiling, the walls that needed painting. It's not much, but it's home. It's more than that, Vincent said quietly. It's refuge. You gave us that tonight when nobody else would have. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. Any decent person would have done the same. No, ma'am, Vincent said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. They wouldn't have. We've been riding together for 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of strangers who've treated us like human beings. What you did tonight, opening your home, sharing your food, treating us with dignity, most people wouldn't do that for their own neighbors, let alone for a group of bikers they'd never met. Then most people need to examine their priorities, Margaret said firmly. Now I'm going to bed. You boys try to get some sleep. Storm should pass by morning and you'll want to get an early start. She left them there in her small house, these 30 men whose society feared and judged, who'd been shown kindness by an elderly widow with almost nothing to give except humanity. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, stepping carefully over the boards she knew were weak, Margaret didn't think she'd done anything particularly special. She'd simply done what needed doing, the way she always had. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Margaret Pearson's house, 30 Hell's Angels slept like they were in sanctuary. Because for the first time in a long time, that's exactly where they were. The morning dawned clear and brilliant, the way it always did after a monsoon. Margaret woke to the sound of motorcycle engines starting, a low, rumbling chorus that gradually built as the bikers prepared to leave. She dressed quickly in her worn house dress and cardigan, made her way carefully down the stairs, and stepped out onto the porch. They were gathered in her yard, their motorcycles gleaming with rainwater, their leather vests dark with moisture. Vincent and Russell stood by the lead bike, and when they saw her, they approached the porch. "Margaret," Vincent said, "we can't thank you enough for what you did. You literally saved us last night." "Oh, stop fussing. You would have been fine." "No, ma'am, we wouldn't have." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is my number. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, you call me, day or night. You understand?" Margaret took the paper, touched despite herself. "That's very kind, Vincent, but I'll be fine. I always am." Russell had been examining the house with a critical eye, and something in his expression made Margaret uncomfortable. He was looking at the sagging roof, the broken windows, the rotted porch boards with the kind of assessment that came from professional experience. "Ma'am," Russell said carefully, "how long has this house been in this condition?" "Oh, a few years. Things wear out when you get to my age." "This isn't wear and tear," Russell said bluntly. "This is structural damage. That roof is about to cave in. Those windows are a safety hazard, and these porch steps could collapse under you any day. You can't live here like this." "Well, I am living here like this, because I don't have much choice in the matter," Margaret said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Now, you boys should get going. That sun will be hot soon, and you've got a long ride ahead of you." Vincent and Russell exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't interpret. Vincent nodded slowly, then extended his hand. "Take care of yourself, Margaret Pearson. And remember, you call if you need anything." She shook his hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip. "Safe travels." She watched them mount their bikes, watched them form up in their riding formation, watched them disappear down Route 66 with a wave and a thunder of engines. Then she went back inside her quiet, empty house and started cleaning up the last remnants of their visit. It was Patricia Walsh who came by that afternoon, her face pinched with disapproval. Patricia lived 3 houses down and had appointed herself the neighborhood watchdog, a role nobody had asked her to fill. "Margaret," Patricia said without preamble, standing on the rotted porch steps like they might contaminate her, "I saw those bikers here last night, a whole gang of them. Are you out of your mind?" "They were caught in the storm, Patricia. What was I supposed to do, let them drown?" "You were supposed to lock your doors and call Sheriff Murphy." "Those were Hell's Angels, Margaret. Criminals, drug dealers, violent men." "Those were human beings who needed help," Margaret corrected. "And they were perfect gentlemen the entire time they were here. More polite than some people in this town, if I'm being honest." Patricia's face flushed. "You don't know what they could have done. You could have been robbed, or worse. At your age, alone in this house. At my age, I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions," Margaret interrupted. "Now, if you've come just to lecture me, you can save your breath. I'm tired, and I have work to do." She went back inside, closing the door perhaps more firmly than necessary. Through the window she watched Patricia storm back down the street, no doubt heading to spread the news to anyone who would listen. By dinner time, everyone in Williams would know that crazy old Margaret Pearson had let a gang of bikers into her house. Let them talk. She'd survived worse than gossip. But as the day wore on, Margaret found herself thinking about what Russell had said about her house. She knew it was bad. She lived with the leaking roof and broken windows every day, but hearing someone else say it made it real in a way she'd been avoiding. The house was falling apart, and she didn't have the money to fix it. Social Security barely covered her food and utilities. There was nothing left for repairs. She climbed the stairs that evening, hand on the railing, feeling every one of her 73 years. The bedroom was hot. The window unit had died 3 summers ago, and she opened the window to let in the cooler night air. Through the screen, she could see the stars emerging, bright and clear after the storm. Margaret thought about Vincent's number, folded in her pocket. She thought about his offer to help if she needed anything. But what could they do? Send money? She'd never accept charity. Fix her house? They had their own lives, their own problems. No, she'd figure this out the way she always had, by making do with what she had and counting her blessings instead of her troubles. She didn't know as she fell asleep that night that Vincent Blackwell had spent the entire day on his phone. She didn't know that Russell Carver had photographed every inch of her house's exterior with clinical precision. She didn't know that word was spreading through the Hells Angels network like wildfire, not just through the Flagstaff chapter, but across Arizona, into California and Nevada, spreading to chapters across the Southwest. She didn't know that 800 bikers were clearing their schedules, calling in favors, pulling together resources, and preparing to descend on Williams, Arizona. All she knew was that she'd done what any decent person would do, and now life would go on as it always had, one day at a time, making do with less, surviving in a house that was slowly crumbling around her. But the Hells Angels knew something Margaret didn't. Debts of honor were always paid, and sometimes the payment came in ways nobody expected. Margaret woke at dawn to a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a deep, continuous rumble that seemed to shake the very ground. She pulled on her robe and went to the window, and what she saw made her heart stop. Motorcycles, hundreds of motorcycles, stretching down Route 66 as far as she could see. They filled her street, her yard, the empty lot across the road. The rumble of their engines was like constant thunder, and they kept coming, wave after wave, pulling in from both directions. Her hands trembled as she dressed quickly and made her way downstairs. When she opened her front door, she found Vincent and Russell standing on her porch, and behind them was a sea of leather and chrome that defied comprehension. "Morning, Margaret," Vincent said with a slight smile. "Hope we didn't wake you." "Vincent, what? How many?" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't process what she was seeing. 800, Russell said. "Give or take a few dozen. We made some calls." "Calls? For what?" Vincent gestured to her house. "You gave us shelter when we needed it. You fed us when you barely had enough to feed yourself. You treated us like human beings when the whole town would have crossed the street to avoid us. That means something in our world, Margaret. That means everything." "I don't understand." "You don't have to," Russell said. "Just know that we're going to fix this house, all of it. New roof, new windows, new porch, foundation work, electrical, plumbing, everything. We've got contractors, carpenters, electricians, plumbers. We've got materials being delivered from Flagstaff. We've got permits fast-tracked through the county." Sheriff Murphy suddenly became very cooperative when he realized we were serious. "And we've got 800 people who want to say thank you the only way we know how, by doing the work ourselves." Margaret's vision blurred with tears. "You can't. This is too much." "It's not nearly enough," Vincent said gently, "but it's what we can do. Now we're going to need you to stay with one of your neighbors for the next 3 days, because this place is going to be a construction site. Is there someone who can take you in?" Margaret thought of Patricia Walsh and nearly laughed. "I don't think—" "I'll take her," a voice called from the street. Grace Thornton, who owned the diner on Route 66, pushed through the crowd of bikers. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Margaret, you can stay with me. I've got a guest room and I'd be honored. Grace, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," Grace said firmly, "because what these men are doing is right, and this town should have helped you years ago. We all knew your house was falling apart, and we all looked the other way. Well, I'm not looking away anymore." The bikers were already moving with purpose. Trucks arrived carrying lumber, shingles, windows, tools. Someone had brought a massive generator. Someone else had organized teams with military precision. Margaret watched, overwhelmed, as her yard transformed into a staging area for the largest construction project Williams had seen in decades. Sheriff Calvin Murphy arrived an hour later. his face a study in conflicted emotions. He pulled up in his cruiser, got out slowly, and approached where Vincent stood coordinating teams. "Blackwell," Murphy said carefully. "This is a lot of people." "It is," Vincent agreed. "All here legally, all with permits, all here to do good work. You got a problem with that, Sheriff?" Murphy looked at Margaret's house, at the organized chaos of construction beginning, at the 800 bikers who were treating this like a sacred mission. "No," he said finally. "No problem at all. You need anything from me? Traffic control, whatever, you let me know." Vincent's eyebrows rose. "Appreciate that, Sheriff." "That woman fed your people when they needed help," Murphy said quietly. "And she's been struggling alone in that death trap of a house for years while this town did nothing. So yeah, I'm going to help. Because it's the right thing to do, even if it took you folks to remind us of that." Margaret watched this exchange from Grace's truck, her belongings packed in a single suitcase beside her. As Grace drove her toward the diner, Margaret looked back at her house. Her falling down, barely standing house that had been her prison and her refuge for 15 years, and saw hope taking shape in lumber and tools and the determined hands of 800 people who had been judged harshly by society but who understood honor better than most. The next 3 days were a blur. Margaret stayed in Grace's comfortable guest room, but she couldn't stay away from the work site. She'd walk over several times a day, watching the transformation with a sense of wonder that bordered on disbelief. The bikers worked with impressive skill and coordination. Russell had organized them into teams based on expertise. Carpenters worked on framing and structural repairs. Electricians rewired the entire house. Plumbers updated all the fixtures. Roofers stripped away the damaged shingles and installed new ones. They worked from dawn until well after dark, with lights rigged up when the sun went down. Benjamin Hayes, a reporter from the Flagstaff paper, showed up on the second day. He was a lean man in his late 30s with intelligent eyes and a notebook that never left his hand. "Mrs. Pearson," he said, approaching her carefully, "I'd like to do a story on this if you're willing to talk." Margaret was about to refuse. She'd never liked attention. But Grace put a hand on her arm. "Let him tell it," Grace said quietly. "This town needs to see what real community looks like." So Margaret talked, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. She told Benjamin about the storm, about feeding 30 strangers, about treating them with basic human decency. She told him about the house, about Harold, about making do with less for so many years. And she told him about waking up to find 800 bikers ready to rebuild everything she'd lost. "Why do you think they did this?" Benjamin asked. "Because they understand something most people don't," Margaret said, watching a team of bikers carefully installing new windows. "They understand that kindness matters, that small acts of grace can ripple outward in ways we never imagine. I gave them shelter and a hot meal. They're giving me back my home. But more than that, they're showing this town, showing the world, that honor and goodness aren't determined by how you dress, or what you ride, or what group you belong to. They're determined by what you do when nobody's watching, and by whether you pay your debts." The story ran on the front page, and then it went viral. News trucks appeared, national media picked it up. The story of an elderly widow and 800 Hells Angels became a symbol of something larger, of humanity transcending prejudice, of community forming in unexpected places, of kindness being returned 100-fold. The town of Williams watched and learned. Businesses that would have locked their doors when the bikers arrived instead brought food and water. Residents who would have crossed the street came to watch and offer help. Patricia Walsh, shamed by the attention, eventually showed up with a grocery bag full of supplies and a tight-lipped apology. Murphy coordinated with the state police to manage traffic, but made sure the bikers knew they were welcome. On the third day, as the sun set over the San Francisco peaks, Vincent found Margaret sitting on her new porch, solid boards, level steps, fresh paint that gleamed white in the fading light. "Want to see inside?" he asked. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Vincent offered his arm and she took it, letting him guide her through her front door. The transformation was complete. New hardwood floors gleamed in the evening light. The walls had been repaired, patched, and painted a soft cream color. The kitchen had new cabinets, new countertops, new appliances. The bathroom had been completely renovated. Upstairs, her bedroom had a new window unit, fresh paint, and a sturdy floor that didn't creak or sag. Every room had been transformed from barely livable to beautiful, but it was the small touches that broke her. The framed photo of Harold that someone had cleaned and rehung, the quilt her grandmother had made that had been carefully preserved and placed on her bed, the vegetable garden out back that had been expanded and protected with new fencing. "We replaced everything that was broken," Russell said, appearing in the doorway. "Updated everything that was outdated. And we set up an account with the hardware store. It's already paid up for the next 10 years. Anything needs fixing, you call them, they'll take care of it. No arguments." Margaret sat down heavily on her new couch, overwhelmed. "I can't possibly repay this." "You already did," Vincent said, kneeling beside her so they were eye to eye. "Margaret, you didn't just give us shelter from a storm. You gave us something we rarely get: respect, dignity. You looked at us and saw human beings, not criminals or outcasts or statistics. Do you have any idea how rare that is, how precious?" "It should be common," Margaret said through her tears. "It should be," Vincent agreed. "But it's not. And when we find it, when someone shows us that kind of grace, we remember, we honor it, and we pay it forward." He stood, gestured around the house. "This isn't charity, Margaret. This is a debt of honor, and we're proud to pay it." The next morning, 800 bikers gathered in Margaret's yard one final time. They'd accomplished in 3 days what should have taken 3 months. The house stood transformed, solid and beautiful, a testament to what could be achieved when community, even an unconventional community, came together with purpose. Margaret stood on her new porch, still overwhelmed, still tearful, and tried to find words adequate to express what she felt. In the end, she kept it simple. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Thank you for seeing past what the world told you about me, and thank you for showing me, showing all of us, what real community looks like. I'll never forget this. Never." The bikers mounted their motorcycles. 800 engines roared to life, a sound like rolling thunder that echoed off the hills. They pulled out in formation, a river of chrome and leather flowing down Route 66, and as they passed Margaret's house, each one touched their hand to their heart in salute. When the last bike disappeared around the bend, the silence was profound. Margaret stood alone on her porch, this solid, beautiful porch on this solid, beautiful house, and felt something she hadn't felt in 15 years: hope. The months that followed brought changes to Williams that nobody could have predicted. Benjamin Hayes's story had gone viral, and it changed the town's relationship with the motorcycle community. When convoys passed through now, businesses stayed open, people waved. Murphy made sure they knew they were welcome to stop and spend time, and many did. Grace's Diner became an unofficial meeting place, with bikers stopping in regularly to check on Margaret. Vincent and Russell visited monthly, always with some excuse. Just passing through, wanted to make sure everything was holding up, thought you might need this or that. They never admitted that they were going 200 miles out of their way to do it. Margaret's daughter Rebecca called for the first time in 8 years after seeing the news story. Their conversation was awkward, painful, but it was a beginning. Rebecca promised to visit at Christmas, and Margaret found herself believing it might actually happen. But the most significant change was in Margaret herself. She'd spent 15 years making do with less, surviving, enduring. Now, in a house that was solid and secure, she began to live again. She invited Grace over for dinner. She started attending church again. She joined a book club. She planted flowers in her repaired garden and actually believed she'd be around to see them bloom. On a cool October evening, 6 months after the reconstruction, Margaret sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the San Francisco peaks in shades of gold and rose. A familiar rumble announced Vincent's arrival before she saw his motorcycle pull into her driveway. "Evening, Margaret," he said, removing his helmet. "Vincent, this is a surprise." "Got something for you," he said, pulling an envelope from his vest. "Open it." Inside was a deed, her house deed, completely paid off. The mortgage that Harold had taken out to cover medical bills, the loan she'd been slowly drowning under for 15 years, it was gone. "Vincent, you can't—" "Already done," he interrupted. "The club took a vote. That house is yours, free and clear. No more mortgage, no more worry. You've got your social security, you've got a solid house, and you've got family checking in on you. You're set, Margaret. You're finally set." She couldn't speak, could only hold the deed with shaking hands and cry. Vincent sat beside her on the porch steps, those solid, well-built steps. "You know what you taught me, Margaret. You taught me that the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. You didn't feed us because you expected something in return. You didn't offer shelter because you thought we'd repay you. You did it because it was right, because you saw people who needed help, and you had help to give. That's it. That's the whole secret." "It shouldn't be a secret," Margaret said. "No," Vincent agreed, "it shouldn't. But it is. Most people don't see it. They're too busy judging, too busy protecting themselves, too busy deciding who deserves help and who doesn't." He looked at her house, at the solid walls and new roof, at the transformation that 800 bikers had accomplished in 3 days. "You taught us something important, Margaret. You taught us that sometimes the people society fears are the ones who understand honor best. And you taught this whole town that their prejudices were misplaced." As darkness fell and the stars emerged, Margaret thought about that storm 6 months ago, about 30 bikers seeking shelter, about the choice she'd made to open her door instead of locking it. She thought about Patricia Walsh's warnings, about the fear in people's eyes, about the judgments that had been made and proven wrong. She thought about 800 Hells Angels descending on a small Arizona town to rebuild the house of an elderly widow who'd shown them simple kindness. She thought about how that act had rippled outward, changing not just her life, but the life of an entire community, proving that honor and goodness existed in places society never thought to look. Most of all, she thought about Harold's words. "That character is revealed in how you treat people who can't do anything for you." She treated 30 strangers with dignity and compassion, expecting nothing in return, and in return they'd given her everything. The screen door no longer hung crooked, the roof no longer sagged, the windows were whole, and the porch was solid, and the house stood strong against whatever storms might come. And Margaret Pearson, 73 years old and finally truly home, understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply open your door to strangers and treat them like human beings. Because you never know, those strangers might turn out to be angels, even if they ride motorcycles and wear leather vests and bear a name that makes people cross the street. Especially then. Margaret lived in her restored house for 11 more years, and every single month, like clockwork, Vincent or Russell or some other member of the Hells Angels would stop by to check on her. They brought her groceries when she couldn't drive. They shoveled her walk in the rare Williams snowstorms. They installed handrails when her arthritis made the stairs difficult. They became the family she'd lost, and she became something sacred to them, proof that goodness still existed in the world, that their choices mattered, that honor meant something. When she passed away peacefully in her sleep at age 84, 800 Hell's Angels returned to Williams, Arizona for her funeral. They stood in formation, silent and solemn, as the town that had once feared them mourned a woman who taught them all a lesson about humanity. And on her gravestone, beside Harold's, someone placed a small metal plaque. It wasn't signed, but everyone knew who'd put it there. It read simply, "She saw human beings where others saw monsters. She gave shelter when others gave fear. She changed everything. Because she had. One act of kindness, one hot meal, one open door, and everything changed. For Margaret, for 800 bikers, for a small town in Arizona that learned that prejudice blinds you to the very people who might save you. For everyone, the lesson was simple, but it was everything. Treat people with dignity, show kindness without expectation of reward, and trust that human goodness exists in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the angels wear leather and ride motorcycles, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply feed strangers during a storm.